Hello, and thank you for joining the CannAtlantic Conference, the country's first Mid-Atlantic cannabis conference brought to you by the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists. I'm Tahit Chappelle, and I'm an executive board member of the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists. Today, we're going to be talking about Delaware's state cannabis market, and presenting Delaware's State of the State Cannabis Report is Zoe Patchell, Executive Director for the cannabis advocacy group DelawareCAN. Get to learn what's happening in the first state. Take it away, Zoe.
Hi, my name is Zoe Patchell. I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Delaware Cannabis Advocacy Network. I'm an activist, a cannabis advocate, and I'm employed as a paralegal. I've been advocating for cannabis policy reform on a local, state, and federal level since 2010. In 2013, I helped co-found the local Delaware NORML chapter, and that same year, we also co-founded Cannabis Bureau of Delaware, a grassroots citizen lobby group, which we inevitably incorporated as Delaware Cannabis Advocacy Network as an official 501c4 nonprofit in 2016. So DelawareCAN is focused on removing the civil and criminal penalties for cannabis offenses and legalizing cannabis for adults 21 and older to include expungement for past cannabis offenses, as well as robust consumer safety protections. Delaware doesn't have voter referendum like the other states that have legalized. So the only way to reform cannabis laws in Delaware is by directly lobbying our elected officials and going through the legislative process. So we formed DelawareCAN as a citizen lobbying organization to predominantly focus on legislative and policy reforms. Our main activities include direct action, citizen lobbying, and outreach. And to date, we've organized or participated in over 350 events since inception, including citizen lobby days, town halls and public forums, expungement and pardon seminars, know your rights seminars, advocacy trainings, canvassing, event tabling, our annual 5K expungement fundraisers, and we regularly attend local political, civic, and community events to represent cannabis reform in the community. So media plays a rather large role in citizen advocacy, and we're extremely lucky to have receptive media organizations here in Delaware who frequently cover the cannabis policy reform movement. COVID has had somewhat of an impact on coverage with the lack of legislation and events. But if you Google Delaware Cannabis right now for news stories, you will see evidence of our latest letter writing campaign, which is focused on highlighting the access problems with Delaware's medical cannabis program. So you see, we have some great letters to the editor written by members of our medical cannabis working group and other volunteers that have recently been published in Delaware's main media outlets. And there's also some coverage of the Delaware Medical Cannabis Program now allowing home delivery for patients, which happened about a month after COVID. So Delaware cannabis policy reform efforts began in 2009, and we have certainly come a very long way with basically a decade of incremental reforms, beginning with the Medical Marijuana Act. The first version of the medical bill was introduced in 2009. Unfortunately, it was tabled in 2010, but another version was introduced and subsequently passed in 2011, which created the Medical Marijuana Act as we know it today. Unfortunately, the program was immediately met with many delays. The governor at the time immediately suspended the program. While the program began accepting patient applications and issuing cards in late 2012, it would be many, many years before the patients would have safe access in the form of compassion centers in the state of Delaware. So our organized advocacy efforts began in 2013 with the formation of Delaware NORML and Cannabis Bureau, which inevitably became DelawareCAN. And our first efforts were focused on trying to get the state to fully implement the 2011 medical program. So regulations for the medical program were promulgated in 2013, 2 years after the bill became a law. So you can see the immediate delay that the program has faced. Despite the law requiring 3 compassion centers to be open by 2013, the governor at the time unilaterally created what was known as a pilot program that licensed one single compassion center. That compassion center was located in Wilmington, which is basically like the most northern part of the state. And it created significant access issues for many of the patients throughout the state. Delaware isn't the biggest state, but it's big enough where placing one sole compassion center at the northernmost tip of the state forced patients to travel extremely long distances for safe access to their medicine. It wasn't until 2017 that a second compassion center would open, and that same year, a third and fourth compassion center were licensed. Despite delay in implementation, over 24 amendments to the original Medical Marijuana Act have been introduced, and many of them have actually passed unanimously, including pediatric medical, known as Riley's Law and led by Jay and Riley Madler. We passed statewide decriminalization in 2015, which includes possession up to an ounce of cannabis. We also helped pass expungements for simple possession offenses in 2018. And we've been working on adult use, which was originally introduced in 2017. It passed committee that year, and then it carried over into the 2018 session, where it inevitably met its fate by failing by 4 votes because of the supermajority vote requirement. The second version of the adult use bill was introduced last year in 2019. It also passed committee 8-3. In the House, it carried over to the second half of the legislative session, which actually began at the beginning of this year in 2020. But due to COVID, it unfortunately never got a vote and died at the end of the session. Just a brief background, Delaware's legislative session runs for 2 years, election year to election year, but the legislature only meets January through June 30th. This year, COVID claimed most of our legislative session, with many pending bills dying this past June 30th without ever getting a vote. While 2 medical amendments did pass in the first half of the session last year, medical home cultivation, adult use, and other cannabis reform bills were claimed by COVID. Unfortunately, the next available chance to pass adult use legalization and other cannabis policy reforms won't come until January 2021. So Delaware's medical program has exponentially grown over the years. Currently, there are over 10,000 registered medical cannabis patients with over 12,000 active patient caregiver certifications in the state of Delaware. There are currently 6 classifications of medical certifications, including pediatric medical, known as Riley's Law, which allows pediatric patients access to high CBD, low THC cannabis oil that's capped at 7% THC. Like I said, that measure passed completely unanimously and was led by Jay and Riley Madler. We also have adult medical, which currently allows certification for 16 qualifying conditions. There's also the compassionate use card, which allows doctors to recommend medical cannabis for ailments that are not covered by the qualifying conditions. However, it requires that applicants submit extensive documentation, as well as forces doctors to continue to follow up with the program about the eligibility of their patients. We also have the CBD Rich Only card, which actually passed earlier this year, which allows access to high CBD, low THC cannabis and cannabis products, also capped at 7% THC, eligible for those diagnosed with anxiety disorders. And there's also caregiver classifications for both pediatric and adult patients. Patients are able to possess up to 6 ounces at any given time. New conditions are added by petition or legislation. However, the petition process has been very unsuccessful over the years, where most ailments are added through legislation. To become a patient in Delaware, you must be a Delaware resident who's diagnosed with a qualifying illness and have a Delaware licensed doctor sign the medical marijuana application. The application, as well as the applicable medical records and $50 fee, must be submitted to Delaware's medical marijuana program. And it typically takes about 2 weeks for approval. And then upon receiving the certification card, a patient can access any compassion center in the state. Unfortunately, there are currently only 3 providers in 6 locations statewide, which is causing significant access issues due to limited market participants here in Delaware. These access problems have only compounded since COVID and include serious supply issues, extremely limited and inconsistent product availability. Patients are forced to wait in long lines or have long wait times in order to purchase their medication. There's also very steep prices for medicine, which unfortunately is not covered by insurance here in Delaware, as well as patients being forced to purchase only small quantities at a time, and they're not able to purchase larger quantities like half ounces or ounces or anything that would help them stock up and not have to frequent the dispensaries as much. So the licensing process for new compassion centers is very tightly controlled. However, the program is now accepting new applications for the first time in years. Currently, right now, the deadline to apply is October 28th at 11 a.m. And includes a $5,000 non-refundable application fee. If selected, the applicant must pay a $20,000 registration fee to be licensed. And the program requires that compassion centers be vertically integrated. So a registered compassion center is responsible for the cultivation, manufacturing of any products like tincture, concentrates, and oils, as well as the sale of the product to the patient. Commercial kitchens to produce edible cannabis products were previously prohibited due to food safety laws here in Delaware. However, earlier this year, the regulations were written to allow for commercial kitchens. However, none of them have currently opened yet, mostly due to the vertical integration requirement that mandates that the compassion centers implement the commercial kitchens in-house in their current operations. So for whatever reason, they've not began that process. And it's definitely something that the patients need because they currently are unable to purchase edibles here in Delaware. Unfortunately, the program also does not allow for home cultivation. We are definitely working on efforts. Like I said, we had a bill that did not get a vote last year. The original law actually allowed for reciprocity for out-of-state patients. However, that provision was removed a few years back. Delivery is now allowed, which actually happened as a response to COVID. So it's definitely something that's somewhat of a silver lining throughout this process. Patients are able to request home delivery for their medicine. We are very fortunate to have very strong employee protection provisions included in the medical cannabis law. So patients who are fired from their employment due to being a medical cannabis patient actually have the right to sue their employer for wrongful termination in the state of Delaware. And there's actually been quite a few cases that have been successfully litigated in favor of the patient because of those strong employee protection provisions. There is also affirmative defense for patients who are not registered with the program, but have a qualifying ailment. So basically it provides protection from conviction if they are arrested for cannabis possession, as long as they're in the legal patient limit of 6 ounces. And thanks to case law litigated by one of our board members, attorney Adam Wadette, probationers can no longer be violated for using their medicine thanks to a judicial decision handed down in State versus Perry that allows probationers who are registered cannabis card holders to use their medical cannabis. So our current medical efforts include strengthening the medical cannabis program through regulatory and legislative changes, including home cultivation, resolving the access problems, removing qualifying conditions, increasing diverse market participants, as well as expanding the program. And HB 243 was the medical home cultivation bill, which was actually a Republican-led effort that was introduced in 2019. Unfortunately, it was tabled in committee this past January 2020 without ever seeing a vote. But it would have allowed patients to cultivate 6 mature and 6 immature plants. So our current efforts are focused primarily on adult use legalization and are being led by our all-volunteer citizen lobby team along with Delaware NORML. Unfortunately, we will need to wait until 2021 to pass adult use legalization. The latest version, as I mentioned earlier, was claimed by COVID and did not get a vote this year. But it was a Democrat-led bill that would have legalized 7 currently illegal acts. It ended probable cause for cannabis, so law enforcement wouldn't be able to search an individual based on the odor of cannabis alone. It also would have ended civil asset forfeiture for cannabis offenses. It included mandatory expungements and strong consumer safety protections. And it also required state agencies to connect programs with and to promote women, minority, and veteran-owned establishments. And applicants would be selected through a competitive scoring process based on family supportive opportunities offered, as well as their social responsibility and diversity plans that they submit in their application. So without voter initiative in our state, the election plays a very significant role in determining our success for any given legislative session. Our Vote for Cannabis campaign is our election-themed public education campaign focused on raising awareness, educating candidates and the public, and collecting and publicizing candidates' positions on cannabis policy reform. And we surveyed all General Assembly, gubernatorial, lieutenant governor, and Delaware congressional candidates on their position on legalization. And then we compiled their answers as well as incumbent voter histories into our 2020 Delaware Cannabis Voter Guide, which can be found at votecannabisde.org. While we are unable to vote directly on cannabis legalization here in Delaware, Delaware residents will be voting for those who will inevitably be voting on cannabis legalization in 2021. And without the voter initiative, it's important that the candidates elected to office support common sense cannabis policy reforms. So this is a big project that we focus on every election year, and you can go to votecannabisde.org to see candidate profiles and where Delaware candidates stand on cannabis legalization. Cannabis prohibition comes with a significant human cost, and legalization is so often overlooked as the significant social and criminal justice reform that it is. Cannabis prohibition is essentially the gateway to the criminal justice system, and decriminalization laws do not do much to fix that problem. Delaware has actually seen a 127% increase in possession-only court filings post-decriminalization, as well as a steep increase in police contact for cannabis. Cannabis possession-only offenses comprise 52% of all the arrests in the state of Delaware, and this does not include felony offenses like sales, manufacturing, cultivation, possession with intent, or any other felony charge. These are exclusively misdemeanor possession-only offenses or civil offenses. And on average, a possession-only offense occurs about 16 times a day or over 100 times a week here in the state of Delaware. While a majority of these offenses do result in a civil citation, since we passed decrim, the amount of police contact with citizens is a huge problem. It's not just the arrest that's the problem. It's any amount of police contact at all, as well as who's being charged with what and how the law is being enforced. There's also the probable cause aspect. Law enforcement is using cannabis as a tool to circumvent Fourth Amendment constitutional protections. So basically, the mere odor of either burnt or raw cannabis allows law enforcement to conduct what is called a probable cause search of an individual and their property based on either the real or imagined odor of cannabis. This is being severely abused by law enforcement, who would typically need to obtain a person's consent to search or would need to get a warrant from a judge. However, just saying that they smell cannabis gives them the ability to conduct a probable cause search completely without consent or without a warrant. And this is a very serious privacy and Fourth Amendment concern issue that does not get enough attention, especially here in the state of Delaware, where law enforcement who regularly lobby against our citizen-led efforts openly admit that this is the main reason to continue prohibition. Decrim is also being discretionarily enforced. While typically an ounce or less should result in a civil citation, we're seeing more and more cases of charge stacking and overcharging, which almost exclusively affects poor communities and communities of color. People with personal use amounts of cannabis are still being charged with misdemeanors or worse through a series of loopholes that law enforcement apply at their discretion. Most frequently used is what's called an aggravating offense, which allows law enforcement to make an arrest for an individual who's in possession of personal use amounts of cannabis if the offense has certain factors, such as where the cannabis is possessed. So, for example, while possessing an ounce or less of cannabis is supposed to be a civil citation, if you have any amount of cannabis in your vehicle, police may choose to increase the charge to an aggravating offense and make an arrest instead of issue a ticket. And these are non-DUI related offenses where the person is simply transporting a personal use amount of cannabis in their vehicle. They're not smoking it. They're not under the influence. They're simply transporting the cannabis maybe in their center console or perhaps in their trunk or somewhere in their car, even in their pocket. But they're being charged with misdemeanor marijuana possession with an aggravating offense instead of being issued a civil citation. Law enforcement is also applying felony charges to simple possession offenses. So felony tampering of evidence charges are being discretionarily applied for individuals who basically attempt to hide or destroy cannabis during a law enforcement interaction. So imagine you're at a party and for some reason police show up and you decide to toss the joint that you're smoking in the toilet or a sink. Law enforcement in Delaware are actually charging people, especially young Black adults, with felony tampering of evidence for trying to ditch their weed when the cops show up. And we've heard a lot of cases of this happening throughout the state and almost exclusively occur when it's a person of color. Other charge stacking includes felony conspiracy second charges for consumers that are busted during buys, as well as charges for endangering the welfare of a child, which is being applied even when the cannabis is secured in areas completely out of reach from children, which unlike most alcohol is kept in family homes. Yet people are still being charged with this extra charge for simple possession amounts. We're also seeing people with personal use amounts being charged with intent to deliver, even when no other evidence of drug dealing exists. Factors used to apply possession with intent include being in possession of nearly any amount of money, or being in what law enforcement have deemed high drug activity areas, or for simply being in possession of multiple packages of cannabis, despite the fact that everybody knows cannabis strains are typically sold in multiple packages to keep the strains separate. That's exactly how they're sold in the state licensed compassion centers. However, there are people that are being charged with felony intent because they have multiple packages. So basically, law enforcement will apply any additional charge to make an arrest instead of issue a civil citation. And this is happening entirely at their own discretion. Current civil asset forfeiture laws also allow police to seize money, property, and other assets for merely being in possession of cannabis and any amount of cash if it's in close proximity to one another. And like I said before, we see this almost exclusively applied to people of color. There's also the problem with person prohibited laws, which is a very serious problem that does not get enough attention. When an individual is convicted for a misdemeanor cannabis offense, they're considered a person prohibited from owning, possessing, or even touching a firearm or ammunition for a 5-year period. And these person prohibited offenses are very serious felony charges that can carry mandatory minimum jail sentences in Delaware. Many of the people that have a cannabis conviction may not even realize that they can be charged with a felony for even touching a gun due to their previous cannabis offense conviction. So no matter where you fall on the gun issue, cannabis should not be used as a tool to remove constitutionally protected rights from some, while others are free to exercise that right, especially when the penalties include long periods of incarceration for violators. Also, all felony cannabis offenses are considered violent felonies in the state of Delaware and are basically permanently make an individual a person prohibited. So all of these offenses are applied at the complete discretion of law enforcement and are significantly disproportionately felt by poor communities and communities of color, basically creating a bifurcated system. According to the ACLU, Delaware ranks 15th highest in the nation for racial disparities in cannabis possession arrests, where African Americans in Delaware are actually 4.2 times more likely to be arrested than a white consumer, despite similar consumption rates across races. And we've only seen this increase since decriminalization. It actually really does not come as much surprise, given the fact that the history of cannabis prohibition was founded and has been perpetuated by racism decade after decade, with the collateral consequences essentially continuing to discreetly serve as an extenuation of Jim Crow laws. The American Bar Association cites 792 collateral consequences associated with arrest and conviction, including statutory and constitutional loss of rights and privileges, including loss of employment, loss of parental rights, loss of voting and gun ownership rights, restricted opportunities, including employment issues, restrictions on living in state and subsidized housing, disqualification from holding professional licenses, the loss of eligibility for federal student aid and loans, and a host of other consequences that make it very difficult for an individual to survive in today's society, let alone compete with their cohorts. So this is extremely problematic. Prohibition also comes with a staggering cost to the taxpayers, with millions of dollars wasted annually on these unnecessary arrests and police interactions. Cannabis prohibition's diverting law enforcement resources away from real public safety. So it's extremely important that we refocus law enforcement to focus only on real crime that has actual victims and reallocate all these resources to focus on helping Delaware citizens instead of holding them back. So here you can see the increase in possession-only offenses, with over 20,000 possession-only offenses post-decriminalization. And once again, it's important to note that cannabis prohibition is being used as a law enforcement tool and is more heavily enforced in poor and Black communities that are disproportionately feeling the effects of this harmful policy. These communities are being over-policed, which is more likely to result in arrest, and citizens are being overcharged, which is more likely to result in a conviction, which leaves an individual suffering from a lifelong collateral consequences as a result. We cannot afford to wait to end these police contacts and their arrest for cannabis. So while we're very close to passing cannabis legalization in Delaware, we are faced with a handful of hurdles and difficulties that we must overcome to pass this measure. And they include that Delaware does not have voter referendum. So legalization bill actually must pass the legislature with a 3/5 supermajority, whereas decriminalization and the medical amendments only need a simple majority. So this requires that we have bipartisan support for the legalization bills. And to overcome this major hurdle, we use direct action, citizen lobbying, monthly lobby days. We We work through the election to try to get candidates that will support cannabis policy reform into office. And we also do canvassing and outreach activities in targeted districts. Another hurdle is that our governor is not supportive of legalization, unlike our neighbors in New Jersey and Pennsylvania that have a very supportive governor who's actually pushing for these reforms. So we have to educate our governor and lobby the governor's office. We use public pressure in the forms of calls and letter writing to help put pressure on the governor and educate him about the facts. And we also attend governor's town hall events and other public events to make sure that cannabis policy reform is represented, and we can try to lobby the governor at any of those events and educate him with the facts. So another issue that's rarely talked about here in Delaware is how 3 state agencies are currently impeding the process that determines the cost of implementation of legalization. So everybody knows, cannabis legalization generates revenue, so it would be a revenue positive or a revenue neutral bill. However, it does have some costs to the initial implementation. And unfortunately, 3 state agencies that are fundamentally opposed to cannabis legalization are actually in charge of various regulatory activities that give them the power to determine how much the cost of implementation is in the state of Delaware. So that's significantly complicating matters as they've padded what's called the fiscal note. So to overcome that, we use direct action, citizen lobbying, once again, public pressure, calls and letters, coalition building, as well as strategic earned media. And perhaps the largest hurdle and difficulty to legalization right now is actually the significant, well-funded, powerful opponents to legalization, which includes over 20 organizations and corporations that oppose cannabis legalization, as well as 5 state agencies, and basically all of law enforcement agencies except for the FOP. And these well-funded organizations and corporations and state agencies obviously have funding to place paid lobbyists in our legislative hall to lobby our elected officials against the will of the 61% of Delaware voters that support legalization. So not only do Delaware citizens foot the bill for cannabis prohibition, but they're actually footing the bill to fund the agencies and some of the organizations to lobby against our citizen-led efforts. So in order to overcome that, we've built a coalition. We use strategic earned media. We organize public awareness campaigns and events, as well as public education and publishing research to counter the misinformation that is put out by the organizations and the agencies that are lobbying against our efforts. So some noteworthy Delaware facts. In living up to its name, Delaware was actually the very first state to garner a simple majority in a legislature for a legal cannabis market bill. Unfortunately, like I said, it requires a 3/5 supermajority, so that bill failed by 4 votes. However, we were the first in the state to get a simple majority, as all the other states that had legalized prior to that bill had done so via voter referendum, except for Vermont, who did pass legalization through the legislature, but that bill did not include a market. So leaving Delaware the first state to garner a simple majority on a cannabis market bill. It's also important to note Delaware, as the corporate capital of the country, will inevitably play a unique role in the continued growth of the cannabis industry as a whole, mainly due to its friendly corporation laws. While Delaware is not a legal state right now, and there are only 3 total licensed medical cannabis providers in Delaware, there are already many cannabis industry corporations that have incorporated in Delaware. So definitely keep an eye on Delaware for groundbreaking cannabis industry-related corporate law court decisions from Delaware's world-famous Chancery Court, especially as this fledgling industry carves its niche into the mainstream. We also have a solid majority of public support for legalization, and have had for just about a decade now here in Delaware, with the latest polls showing 61% support according to a 2018 University of Delaware poll. Delaware also has a very large pre-existing consumer base, with approximately 17.4% or 115,000 to 146,000 Delaware adults who admit to consuming cannabis, according to a self-reporting survey by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration. And those are just the ones who admit it. The current policy basically potentially places this rather large demographic of Delaware adults in danger of being exposed to the many harms of prohibition, including police contact, arrest, civil asset forfeiture, conviction, and of course, the many collateral consequences associated with arrest and conviction. So it's imperative that these arrests and the police contact end immediately. Lastly, Delaware is on the brink of legalization. We project Delaware to legalize in 2021. We believe it actually would have happened this year had it not been for COVID. However, we're actually even closer than ever before since Delaware's recent primary election. State politics decides the fate for legalization in Delaware, as well as other states that don't have voter referendum. So it's so important that people get out and register to vote, stay informed, and vote for cannabis in November. For more information, you can go to DelawareCannabis.org and to find out more information about how you can help Delaware be the next state to legalize.
Hello, everyone. If you are watching this live, we have just heard from Zoe about the Delaware State of State Cannabis Report, all things about the first state. I have to say, Zoe, you are watching this live. We have just heard. I think there's a little bit of feedback. Can you hear me, Zoe?
I can hear you. Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. So, the first state is obviously, I think you had mentioned in your slide that Delaware was close to legalizing. That's true?
Yes, we're incredibly close to legalizing. We're on the brink of legalization. We think we would have actually passed legalization this past legislative session that ended on June 30th, had it not been for COVID. But basically, our session runs January to June 30th every year, and COVID took a big chunk of that. They weren't meeting in person. They were only doing virtual sessions at the end of session, like basically for the last 3 or 4 weeks before the session ended. And they refused to take up quote unquote controversial issues that didn't, have some kind of impact. We argued obviously that there is a direct impact, both on, two very relevant nationwide subjects right now, obviously the COVID recovery and, creating jobs and things like that, and creating opportunities for people to be able to survive post pandemic and whatnot, and helping aid in the recovery efforts, as well as obviously, the looming issue of police contact with citizens, and the effects of having over police communities, and obviously the racial disparities and things like that. So legalization would address those issues, but for whatever reason, they didn't take it up. But we're actually working with sponsors now, the current sponsors to the last bill, and in trying to negotiate different terms to strengthen that bill for the 2021 session, including, increasing the equity pieces and the different provisions for expungement and things like that are included in HB 110. And we're looking forward to a bill being introduced in January.
Everyone, I just wanted to give a quick introduction to Charlana. Charlana, do you mind giving viewers a
Hi, my audio is a little off.
That's all good.
Hi, guys. This is Charlana McKeithen here.
Hi, Charlana. Thanks for joining us.
Charlana, can you give people a little bit of background information of who you are?
I'm sorry?
Can you give people a little bit of background information of who you are?
I'm Charlana McKeithen. I work with different organizations. One is with Zoe with DelawareCAN as the chair of the development committee. I'm also the executive director of Garden State Normal in New Jersey, and a part of CAG, Cage without an E, Cannabis Advisory Group. I'm a part of that group also, and I'm an advocate. I'm a medical marijuana patient.
Thanks for coming on, Charlana. We were just talking about the fact that Delaware was close to legalizing in 2019, and it feels like it will be legalizing in 2021. I feel like if Zoe is pretty confident, there's a little bit of confidence behind there too. I'm going to ask a question that just came into one of our chats. Lynn Washington, who is a Delaware resident, asked if there are particular names of corporations or organizations that have been vocally or actively opposed to cannabis legalization. Are there any people that, or any organizations rather, that you can name that have been part of the opposition, so to speak?
Yes, so we have actually over 24 either five state agencies and about 24 nonprofit organizations that oppose cannabis legalization. They've actually formed a coalition, which is called Keep Delaware Safe and Healthy Coalition. And it includes AAA. So we recommend that people cancel their AAA membership as they continue to lobby different state legislatures, including New Jersey, Delaware, and a few others, to impede the legalization process. It also includes Attack Delaware, Medical Society of Delaware, the Delaware State Chamber of Commerce, which is one of the largest predominant organizations pushing to thwart our citizen-led efforts here in Delaware. We also have almost every single law enforcement agency in Delaware opposed to this, who regularly show up to our different hearings and the different bill votes and whatnot in uniform with, over 50 officers, in almost like an intimidation, like kind of tactic or whatever. Ironically, the FOP is actually neutral. So they're not lobbying against our efforts, but they're not also supporting them, obviously. But that was definitely something that occurred through lobbying those organizations as well. We also have, obviously, DuPont. We live in the state, the home state of DuPont. They've definitely had a hand. Nemours have actually opposed the pediatric provisions to the Medical Marijuana Act as well. So they've been definitely on the forefront of lobbying our elected officials to stop legalization. And there's actually three of which are actually tasked with a various form of regulatory activity post-legalization. So as I mentioned in my presentation, that's definitely been one of the biggest hurdles. So not only do Delaware taxpayers pay for the large cost of prohibition, which is estimated at $22.3 billion here in Delaware annually, that's the unnecessary arrests and different things like that. But they're also footing the bill for the state agencies that are hiring paid lobbyists to be at Legislative Hall lobbying our elected officials against our citizen-led efforts.
Charlana, I have a question for you. Given that you are also involved in different parts of legalization efforts, one in New Jersey and in Delaware, how do you kind of go between, seeing what's happening in New Jersey, where there's going to be a vote in November, and seeing the movement in Delaware? What are some of the takeaways that you can tell audience members about your involvement in just seeing two different types of movements moving forward?
One of the big things with me is we have to advocate across state lines. Look at our situation with Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. And it's like when one state does something regarding legalization or medical, the other states try to follow behind or jump ahead of the state that's currently doing something. And us as advocates and even industry, we have to look at that, and we have to utilize that to help us do what we need to do as advocates and industry to get things done. The other thing is we also, for example, with social equity, we need to look at what other states have already done, analyze that, and then put something together that works, a template that can work across the country and then be adjusted per state based upon that state laws and then local municipalities. So I think it's very important for us to support other advocates in other states, because that's what's going to help us get the job done. Also, in a situation like New Jersey, we started having problems with legislatures and kind of in-party disagreements. Well, what happens in South Jersey, Delaware looks at and South Jersey looks at what Delaware does, and it puts pressure on each other. So we have to really start looking at that aspect of trying to get things
Zoe,
accomplished.
really appreciate your time,
industry.
spending some time this morning with us. Really appreciate the information that has been shared about Delaware and what's happening in the first state. For those who are watching, we will move into the West Virginia state of the state shortly. I believe the Delaware State Caucus and Networking Lounge will be open. If it should be open right now. So if Zoe and Charlana, if you're going to be heading over there, hopefully some people are going to be hanging out there. If you're not in the caucus room right now for Delaware and you are from Delaware, go check it out. Go connect with some people, mix and mingle, and build some relationships. But Zoe, Charlana, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tahi. Zoe, hugs and kisses.